Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. I'm so happy that you're here once again, or that you're here for the first time if you're a new listener. Today I have a fantastic interview with Dr. Bill Campbell, who's currently a professor of exercise science and the director of the Performance and Physique Enhancement Lab at the University of South Florida. In this interview, I had the honor and the pleasure to be able to pick his brain on all things fat loss, starting from how likely it is to lose muscle when we're dieting to lose body fat, what we can do to minimize that occurrence, the benefits of diet breaks and refeeds or lack thereof, based on the research we have available right now, the benefits of cardio as a fat loss tool, and so much more. Dr. Campbell has 20 years of experience doing research in areas related to physique enhancement, sports nutrition, resistance training, and dietary supplementation. And he was very generous with this knowledge in this interview. So I think you're going to take a lot of value from it, and you're going to be able to apply this knowledge, most importantly, to your own physique enhancement journey. So without further ado, let's get straight into the interview. Hello, Dr. Campbell, and thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
So before I start picking your brain, which I'm quite excited about, I want to ask you, so that the audience can get to know more about you. Who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at what you do?
I like that question. I'm a professor of exercise science at the University of South Florida, which is located in Tampa, Florida. And I'm very blessed to direct a research lab called the Performance and Physique Enhancement Laboratory. And in that laboratory, I get to do research focused on building muscle and losing body fat, typically through diet, sometimes exercise interventions, and dietary supplements.
That's a great introduction. Thank you for that. And the reason why you're here is that you are part of that lab, because with this podcast, I really try to share valuable information on how to enhance someone's physique via training and nutrition protocols. So since you have so many years of experience in research, my first question is actually about your philosophy about science. How would you recommend that someone view and use science in pursuit of their physique goals?
I think it's important to get to know what the evidence says on a particular category. And I know for a lot of people it's difficult because a lot of people aren't trained as scientists and they don't really necessarily have the time. So in that case, find people that you think are credible and you trust, you build a relationship with them. And I granted it's probably like through a virtual relationship, but you would trust them and their interpretation of the research. So that's kind of like something that I do on my Instagram page. I kind of read a lot of research and I just share my thoughts. So that would be one way. And then once you get some of the knowledge of what the research is indicating, you then want to distill that and apply it to your life, and then appreciate that even what the science says might not be best for every person. So just because the scientific literature says something, it also has to work for the individual if we're focusing this on fat loss, if that's the focus here. So I think the science should guide the process, and then the person's experience should refine it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Thank you for sharing that because I wanted to ask you this question because I feel that sometimes the loudest voices are the most extreme, and in, when we come in terms of this topic, I've noticed that there are two extreme voices. One shouting that science is the end all be all, and the other shouting that science doesn't matter because it's not applicable to the individual. So all that matters is anecdotal experience, basically what works for you. And it sounds like what you're suggesting is to use science as a compass to give you some direction, but then also rely on your own anecdotal experience on what actually works for you as an individual. Would that be correct?
Yeah, you said it much better than I did. Thank you.
I listen. I'm good at listening.
Yeah, I like that compass analogy. That was good. I'm going to use that from now on.
Oh, you're welcome. I take so much from your Instagram posts that you can definitely take this one analogy from me.
Oh, awesome.
All right. Now we've mentioned fat loss, and because again you have a lot of experience with this, um, I do want to discuss this on the podcast today as the main topic. Now that we've established how we want to view science, so my first question is about the likelihood of fat loss during a fat loss phase, or fat loss of muscle loss during a fat loss phase. I feel that it's commonly acknowledged as inevitable and in any under any all circumstances during a diet, but I'm not quite sure if that's a nuanced enough explanation for what happens there.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that has to happen.
Hmm.
What typically happens, so I think we can appreciate that almost all of the research on fat loss comes from individuals with obesity. And
Yes.
what we appreciate there is that when individuals with obesity, when they're in research studies and they lose body weight, about three-fourths of the body weight that they lose comes from body fat stores, and the other 25% or one-fourth is coming from lean tissue, the lean tissue compartment. So that's kind of like the what I like to call it is like my guideline. If we're losing less lean tissue than 25%, we're doing very good. And if we're
Mm.
losing more than that, well, then we're doing something wrong. And the other consideration is a lot of people go on diets to lose body fat that really don't need to do that. They don't have excess body fat to lose. So it's possible then that they're they are more likely to lose more lean tissue since they have more to lose. So we have to also just approach it with where somebody's starting from. But in terms of the expectation that you'll lose lean tissue, I think today we have enough research, published research, that guides us on the principles to prevent the loss of lean mass when dieting. And let's just mention what a few of them are. The first one is to not be very aggressive. So you don't want to go on what we would call here in our country crash diets. I don't know what you would refer to it as, but you're not starving yourself for long periods of time. So you're taking your time, you're being patient. And then the second one is you are eating adequate amounts of protein in your diet. Protein is like an anabolic nutrient, so that helps maintain muscle mass. And then the third area is just exercise, specifically resistance exercise when dieting. That also is an anabolic stimulus to the body. So those three things, not not being aggressive, getting enough protein, and resistance training, that will allow you to maintain as much lean tissue as possible when you're in a fat loss phase.
That makes a lot of sense. Let's delve a little bit into each of them in turn. So when you say that one shouldn't be too aggressive, so we call them crash diets here in the UK as well. I think most listeners will understand how extreme these kind of diets are. But when you say not be too aggressive, what would you recommend as a reasonable rate of fat loss?
Yeah, if I were going to try to just be very applied, if somebody eats 4 meals per day, maybe they would only eat 3 meals per day. So that's like 25% less calories than what they would typically eat
Mm.
That's the approach that I take. I don't really like skipping meals for people. What I prefer is a caloric deficit as a percentage. So if you're normally eating 100% of your calories, a level of 25% less than what you normally eat, where you're maintaining your body weight, is a really good place to start. It's what we kind of use in my research lab. And what we've shown is that at that level, it's aggressive enough to cause pretty noticeable fat loss, but it's not aggressive enough that you're losing a lot of lean muscle tissue.
Oh, that's interesting. So normally I've seen in many cases that what's recommended is a rate of body weight loss, usually over a week. So
Yeah,
is there a reason why you do agree with that, or that recommendation? Do you have your own? Is there a reason why you mentioned specifically the reduction in caloric intake?
yeah. So it's funny that you mentioned the rate of weight loss on a weekly basis. What I just recommended, a 25% caloric reduction for most people, and again, we're talking about people that are not obese.
Hmm.
These would be people that are relatively fit when they're going on a fat loss diet. That caloric deficit of 25% actually puts them at around, on average, about a 1% loss of body weight per week. Uh,
Oh, okay.
so it's kind of equal there. And the problem is when you start losing more than 1% of your body weight per week, that's when you start losing more lean tissue. And and again, that's we want to avoid that. There's several harms when you lose lean tissue when dieting in terms of it sabotaging your future fat loss success.
That makes sense. So essentially, if you're looking at it from a caloric intake perspective, 25% deficit is enough to see reasonable fat loss without incurring excessive lean mass loss. If you're looking at it from a body weight lost per week perspective, then up to 1% body weight lost per week, if you do not live with obesity, is what you would recommend.
Yeah, and I like how you said up to 1%. 1% would be the upper range that I would recommend.
Okay, perfect. Yes, I believe that any fat loss progress is progress.
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So the second point you made was about protein. In terms of protein recommendations, what would be yours?
I like to give a range, and then I'm gonna have a follow-up statement after I give the range. So I think a really good range is when dieting, 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Somewhere in there is what helps us to maintain our lean mass. Now, my follow-up statement to that is some people struggle getting even the lower end of that range. They struggle to get 1.6. So to that type of person, I would say, well, can you get more than what you otherwise would if I weren't helping you? So if you're getting one and you're just hating your life, you don't like to get 1.6. It's making you miserable. You're not looking forward to eating the foods. What if we tried 1.2 or 1.4? Can we get you more? Because the more protein you eat, the greater the benefit that you get. Now, the reason that I like to cap the range is because as you keep increasing protein intake, the additional benefits become less and less and less. Now they're still there, but the biggest benefits are going from 1 to 1.4 to 1.6 to 1 point, and again, it just gets lower and lower and lower. So there's a benefit with higher amounts of protein, but that benefit becomes less so the more protein we get.
Mm. I also think that in the case of a calorie restricted diets, I would cap protein to where we get the maximum benefits. Uh, Also for the reason that if you don't have a lot of calories available, it becomes more difficult to get enough of all the nutrients in addition to protein.
Yes, and I'm going to throw out a statement that some people, for whatever reason, they find it controversial. I think it's very hard to gain body fat by overeating on protein.
Mm.
I've never seen it in the research literature. There's a few studies, a handful, where when they have resistance training people increase protein, they typically, or they have, there's been no reports of them gaining body fat. Sometimes they actually lose body fat, other times they just maintain. So, but a lot of people don't want to eat all of that protein. And like you said, then you have to be cautious of, we don't want them on a really low carbohydrate diet. That seems to not be ideal for an anabolic environment. And the
Mhm.
same thing with body fat. Body, or I'm sorry, dietary fat intakes. If that gets too low, that can create some hormonal problems, like particularly in males, a suppressed testosterone production. So with carbs and fat, I am very general. Like, go with what you like. Just avoid the extremes is my advice.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. In terms of protein quality, what do you think about primarily? So, for one, I have actually a couple of questions on this. In research, when researchers state or give recommendations or state a certain amount of protein is used in a study, do they refer to 100% um, complete protein, or is there a percentage of incomplete protein that's also used? And then the second question would be, what do you recommend in terms of a ratio of complete versus incomplete protein, if you have any ideas on this?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think researchers typically specify the ratio of complete to incomplete, and I'm guilty of that myself. I can tell you what my assumption is, and I think it's what most people's assumptions are.
Mm,
That is that the majority of the protein intake is coming from high quality or complete sources. And then, of course, there'll be some amount of incomplete protein sources from that. But as long as you're getting enough of the essential amino acids, that's not going to cause much harm. Um, I would say in the studies that are like, let's just say, non-animal protein supplementation studies, those studies probably do a much better job of delineating the exact ratios. But my assumption is, and I think this is true for most researchers, that the majority of the protein intake, whether that be 80%, 90%, is coming from complete sources of protein.
okay, that's interesting because I think I heard someone on a couple of podcasts mention that it was a 50-50 split in studies. So I thought there was some sort of consensus, but it sounds like there isn't really. It's simply not stated.
Yeah, well, and again, I'm looking at this from what I'm assuming. I don't know who your guest was, but they may be have more knowledge than I have, and that would be the case. Now, I can speak from my own research studies. We've done,
Mhm.
I'd say, about 4 different studies where we've prioritized protein. One of those we actually did food records. The others were macro, like macro tracking. But the majority was right around what I'm saying. If I, again, estimating 80, 85% high quality or complete protein source.
And would that also be what you would recommend, to aim for a higher percentage of complete protein sources, or an 8 to 85% versus 20 to 15% ratio?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And something else that would worry me if somebody were getting up to half of their calories from non-complete sources of protein. Usually those sources of protein are not very protein dense, so there's a lot more carbs or fat with them. I'm thinking of like vegetable protein, so a lot more carbs with them. And I
Mhm.
would imagine that would cause them to increase their calories rather quickly. And if they're trying to lose body fat, that creates an extra barrier in that process.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that. So we've covered the rate of fat loss, we've covered protein intake. Now, the third component you mentioned was exercise, and I'm assuming you meant resistance training in particular. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be the preferred mode of exercise, but if somebody is not wanting to do resistance exercise, then we can talk about, well, what happens if they're able to do just cardio or aerobic exercise. But if the with the stated goal of trying to do everything we can to maintain our muscle mass, resistance exercise is the best form of exercise to do that. It's an anabolic stimulus to the muscles. And then again, if we couple that with adequate protein, which we just discussed, you're doing as much as you can to promote the retention of muscle mass.
That makes sense. What are your thoughts on a minimum effective dose of resistance training in order to maintain lean mass?
I'd like to think of resistance training on a muscle group perspective or a per body part perspective. And in terms of like a minimal effective dose, let me start with what's optimal. What's
Yes.
optimal is that you would hit or stimulate each muscle group 2 times per week, or at least 2 times per week. So if I'm trying to maintain, the muscles in my back or my chest or my quads, I don't want to do only one leg day. I don't want to only do a chest day. That's only stimulating that muscle group or body part 1 time per week. And we have several studies, and when I say several, it's a handful, that have reported that 1 time per week is not as good as 2 or more times per week. So I like to start there. So try to hit each body part twice per week. And after that, I don't think we know. I'm not aware of a consensus. Is 3 times better than two? Is 4 times better than two? Is four better than three? We don't have those answers. The only answer that I've been able to confidently say is hit each body part at least 2 times per week, and not once. So I guess in a way, the minimal effective dose would probably be 2 whole body resistance training sessions per week. So you're hitting each body part twice. That can get a little bit long in terms of how long you would be in the gym for a lot of people. So what I do right now, I'm really liking this. I have a program where I have a 3 day per week, a 4 day per week, and a 5 day per week program. And I kind of just cycle through them. And
Mm.
it's all the same volume. So I'm hitting each body part with 9 work sets per week. Um, and again, it's just a question of whether I do that in 3 days, 4 days, or 5 days per week.
Okay. So you touched upon frequency of training. And what do you think about what would be a minimal effective dose of volume in terms of hard sets performed every week in order to maintain muscle? And also, what would be an optimal amount of volume, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I know this is um, hotly debated a lot. One thing that I think where I would start this discussion is to ask, what are you currently doing? And
Hmm.
that's one major weakness of all of the research in this area. Whenever they've looked at training volume studies, and there's around 30 of them, only two, and really only one in a really good way, did they even consider the amount of training volume that the subjects were doing before they started this study. So that's a major problem. It's a big limitation in this research area. I can Let me start with just a consensus of what would be considered low volume, moderate volume, and high volume.
Absolutely.
So hitting each or stimulating each muscle group with less than 10 working sets per week is considered low volume.
Hmm.
10 to 20, most people in my field would suggest that that's a moderate amount of volume. And then if you're doing 20 or more sets on a muscle group in a week's time, that's considered high volume. Now, competitive bodybuilders, if you look at that research, they tend to be up in the upper range of the moderate to the lower range of the high. So anywhere from like 17 to 22 sets per week. But
Mm.
those are competitive bodybuilders. What I'm currently doing right now is 9 sets per week, which would be considered by most people as being low volume. I'm easily maintaining my muscle mass at that level. And then one other thing, you mentioned the word working sets. I am assuming whenever I talk about sets per week and stimulating a muscle group, I am assuming that any set that I'm talking about is taken to near failure, so that there
Yeah.
is the intensity level meets a threshold of being within 3 repetitions of failure. So, and ideally, probably closer to 1 to 2.
Yes, we agree on that definition. That's exactly what I call a working set or a hard set. And when I
Yep.
quantify volume, I only count those sets because those are the ones that provide the greatest anabolic stimulus,
Yeah.
at least the way I understand it.
And the thing I love about that, there was it was a review paper. It was published in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research, where they validated that exactly
Yeah.
what you just said. I think the authors, you might know of it. It's like Balao. I can't remember the exact author's name, but they said as long as you're training for muscle hypertrophy, as long as most of the sets are between 6 and 20 repetitions, as long as you train to near failure, then that system which we're just describing is validated as a programming method for muscle hypertrophy. It's that validates that as you increase the volume marginally, you would anticipate an appropriate hypertrophic stimulus on the muscles. So that's what I love about that. It's a very simple way to do your programming.
I agree. I like simplification when it is effective. I don't like simplification when it takes away nuance. And in this case, I feel that it's simplification for that actually is effective.
Yes, and I like how you said that too. you, you're very good conceptually. I can see that we would get along.
Yes, I agree. All right. So thank you for explaining that. So you said first you want to start with the volume that you're already doing. Then, as you progress throughout a fat loss phase, do you think that one should increase volume, reduce it? How would you approach the potential for a change in volume, or would you keep everything the same?
I'm That's a good question. I would definitely have to consider the energy level of the person, because if they've been dieting for 16 weeks and their calories are getting low, um, one adjustment that I would suggest making is, especially if we're talking about a competitive bodybuilder getting ready to compete, I would tend to take away the large multi-joint movements like squats and deadlifts as we get closer to competition. One approach that I do like in that case, again, for competitive bodybuilders, is to increase the frequency of their training. So, getting upwards of about 6 days per week in the weight room, so that we're getting constant little bumps of an anabolic stimulus.
Hmm.
And typically, again, depending on the energy levels, I don't think there's an absolute need to increase the volume. I know some people do. And there's not a lot of research on this. I'm aware of a very recently published study. I haven't read it yet. And then I'm also aware of a narrative review that was done. I think it was within the last few years. I know Dr. Brad Schoenfeld was one of the authors on that narrative review, and the consensus was, or at least my interpretation of that um, narrative review, was that there was no necessity to lower or increase when dieting. So maintaining that stimulus was effective for maintaining lean mass.
Yeah, what I find interesting about your answer is that you're saying that not all volume is created equal. So, for example, or at least that's what I gathered, because you mentioned, you would take away the big compound lifts, but then potentially, if we maintain the only the isolation lifts, it's possible that some people might need to actually increase the volume because those exercises are safer. Um, so they are more appropriate if you are very, very lean. However, they might have a slightly reduced stimulus compared to the compound lifts. Would that be a correct interpretation of what you just said?
I think it's possible. I wouldn't. I'd haven't. I'm not knowledgeable enough to say yes, that's correct, or no, I disagree. I would say that the recovery capability, if you're removing the squats and the deadlifts, their ability to recover should be enhanced. And then,
Yes.
like you're saying, then maybe with that enhanced recovery, actually do increase the volume on some single joint movements or muscle groups. Now, I also know people that do not remove those. Some competitors do not, but it is something that I always put on the table if they're
Mm,
feeling run down, if calories are pretty low.
okay. So you would look at any kind of volume manipulation from a perspective of respecting the athlete's recovery capabilities.
Yes, yeah, especially during a diet. So if I were to just take let's just say a hypothetical client who's dieting for a bodybuilding competition, I would initially keep volume the same,
Hmm.
but increase the frequency. So if they're, and I would increase it up to where they're getting about 6 days per week in the weight room. That would be my first change. So volume the same, but frequency spread out. That means the workout windows are probably getting shorter.
Hmm.
And then over time, then we can bring in other modes of cardio to have an additional stimulus on fat loss.
Perfect. Thank you for explaining that. Very interesting perspective. Now, changing tack to discuss nutrition for fat loss a little bit more. Now, we've covered the fundamentals, I believe, of fat loss. So, rate of fat loss, protein intake, and resistance training in order to prevent as much lean mass loss as possible. One of perhaps of a more advanced topic that you've done some research into would be the topic of diet breaks and refeeds. So first, I'd like to cover some definitions. So, how would you define a diet break and a refeed?
Yeah, both of those terms fit under a broader umbrella term called nonlinear dieting.
Hmm.
So let's define nonlinear dieting by stating what it is not. So if somebody were to go on a diet and they stayed on this diet for 6 months or 8 months or a long period of time, and they were in a perpetual caloric deficit, that's what we would call continuous dieting.
Hmm.
Nonlinear dieting is taking some breaks or periods of time, whether it's days, whether it's weeks, or even maybe months, where they're purposefully not dieting any longer. And under that term of nonlinear dieting is where we have diet breaks and diet refeeds. Diet breaks are typically referred to as a 1 week, sometimes 2 week duration of a break from your current diet, where you increase your calories back to your maintenance levels that you were eating before you started your diet. A diet break is very similar, but instead of taking a break for a week at a time or 2 weeks at a time, a diet refeed is typically looked at as a 1 day or 2 day, typically the weekend, where you're increasing your calories to essentially take a break from the diet.
Perfect. Thank you for for covering that. Now, as far as you're aware, and of both the existing research that you've not done and the research that you have done yourself, are there any physiological benefits to diet breaks or refeeds?
So most of the research would or has reported that there is not a physiological benefit. We just published a study, it got published last week, where we investigated resistance trained females doing a 1 week diet break after 2 consecutive weeks of dieting, and we did not find any physiological benefit. There was another study out of Australia that also looked at resistance trained individuals, males and females. They also didn't report any physiological benefit. So, looking at the scientific evidence, most of the literature, and again, we're talking about a handful of studies, has not reported a physiological benefit. One study in obese males, the Matador study, did show greater amounts of weight loss, greater amounts of fat loss, a greater retention of metabolic rate. That seems to be an outlier study. Some have interpreted that study by saying that the people that the subjects in the diet break group simply just adhered to the diet better when they were in their diet weeks, and that explained the findings of that study. So if I were to rely solely on the published research, some of it coming from my own lab relative to diet breaks, I would interpret that as they don't seem to be helpful, but they're also not harmful. Now, I want to just briefly discuss my conversations with a lot of physique coaches working with compete physique athletes getting ready for competition. In that population, we have two things going on. We have extended diet periods, so six or maybe up to 6 months, 20 weeks, 24 weeks of continuous dieting. And many times, because they have to get very lean for their shows, they have to be pretty aggressive in their approaches as well. And in those cases, my what I've learned from some of these coaches is that diet breaks are much more helpful in those more aggressive situations. Now, in the research, the published research, including mine, we're not taking that aggressive approach. So the way that I interpret this is a diet break is likely to be more beneficial if it's like fixing something that a diet is creating, a problem that a diet is creating. If a diet is gradual, there's adequate protein, there's resistance training, a diet break might not offer much in terms of a physiological benefit.
That makes sense. The way I currently use diet breaks, and I tend to coach general population athletes who want to improve their body composition without going to the extremes of bodybuilding. So for them, the way I typically utilize diet breaks or refeeds would be mainly for a psychological benefit. So after 4 to 6 weeks, I tend to check in with them and ask them how consistent they're still being, because I've noticed that when somebody starts being a little bit too burnt out, consistency goes down. If consistency goes down, then the results that they get also decrease, and that creates a vicious cycle where they get frustrated, and their consistency continues to go down because they start thinking, well, what's the point? I want to prevent that cycle from even starting by every 4 to 6 weeks. I will ask them, hey, are you still being as consistent as always? Obviously, if I see that something um, doesn't really look right to me, if everything is looking right, then clearly they're doing well. But I will check in with them, and if they tell me, actually, I feel like I'm more tired than I used to be of this protocol, then that's when I would suggest, okay, let's take 3 days at maintenance calories up to a week. Let's see how you feel afterwards. So that would be how I would normally utilize it. What do you think of that approach?
I like that approach. You're basing it on the feedback of the client. And the other avenue here that I really like is even for non-competitive people, it fits lifestyles very well. So most of us tend to eat more food on the weekends. So I think it makes sense that you would design a diet that would fit into a lifestyle where you tend to eat more food on the weekends. Now that would be more the diet refeed approach.
Hmm.
Um, and then the other thing is in the Australian study, they actually did report a significant improvement in the diet break group, that they had a significantly lower desire to what was the there was a psychological questionnaire. It was desire to eat was significantly lower at the end of the study. And in our study, we also measured psychological impressions of appetite related feelings, and we had a significant improvement in a term called disinhibition. And you want disinhibition to get lower, not higher. And what disinhibition is, it's the propensity to overeat in a stressful situation. And what we found in our study was that the subjects that were only in the diet break group, they reported significantly lower disinhibition scores. It actually went down over the 8-week study as compared to the group of subjects who never took a diet break. So it was almost like, as we interpret that, our subjects were able to take breaks. They were able to eat foods that, at least in my opinion, they said, "Hey, I'm getting good at dealing with increasing my calories and not overeating." Whereas the other group, they never had these breaks, and in their minds, they were much more likely to overeat when the opportunity arose. So, if you were to extrapolate the length of either of these studies, I think there is potential that the diet breaks could have manifested in physiological improvements, because we know that hunger ultimately is one of the primary factors in diet adherence. If you can control hunger, you can adhere to a diet better than if your hunger is elevated.
That is very interesting. I actually wonder, I think it would be interesting to design a study where there's also a follow-up period after the fat loss phase to compare whether the people who who did have diet breaks also feel more confident when it comes to maintaining their weight. Because another reason why I tend to implement diet breaks with a lot of clients is that it helps them practice maintenance, because other most people focus on being really regimented with their nutrition and training when they're trying to lose body fat, but then once they've lost it, they revert to doing what they were doing before, and that's how they often regain that weight. So they effectively never practice management of nutrition and training while at maintenance. And I believe I see even in practice that when somebody knows how to maintain because they've done it for a week every few weeks during a diet, they're much more confident continuing with that after the diet. So I think it would be really interesting to see some research validating whether that's true on average or not.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a skill. It's a skill that, just like anything else, needs to be practiced.
Exactly. Okay, so thank you very much for covering diet breaks and refeeds. Now I have two remaining more no, I wouldn't know. I don't want to say that they're going to be quick questions, honestly, but I think they are interesting because you have so much experience. I believe you've been involved in research for about 20 years now. Is that right?
I've been at my current job for about 15 years, and then I was doing graduate work in obesity for the previous, yeah, 4 to 5 years. So counting my graduate school training, it's right about 20 years.
That's amazing. In that time, you must have seen the fitness industry and health industry and the research evolve. And so I'm wondering, is there anything that you changed your mind about, or something that I believe there are going to be a lot of things, but something that comes up right away if I ask the question, is there anything you massively changed your mind about in regards to nutrition over this time span?
Yeah, I used to think that there was a metabolic advantage to eating a higher meal frequency each day. So if I was going to have, let's say, 2,800 calories, I thought it was better if I had 7 meals of 400 calories each. That would spike my metabolism more than if I had, let's say, 4 meals of 700 calories. And then as I've learned more, I realized no, there really is. There's no evidence to suggest that increasing meal frequency has any benefit on metabolic rate or the thermic effect of food. So that's one of the biggest things that I've changed my mind on.
What do you think? What would you suggest in terms of meal frequency, knowing what you know now?
I Assuming that if somebody comes to me with the goal of trying to maximize their muscle mass, then I think you start with a protein distribution plan where you're getting protein approximately 4, possibly 5 times, evenly spread throughout the day. So let's just say that somebody needs 150 grams of protein. So maybe they get 25 grams 6 times. That's probably a little too much. 30 grams at 5 times in the morning, into the afternoon, and then into the evening. We have very limited evidence that protein distribution that's approximately equated is better for gaining muscle than when you skew protein, meaning that you don't get much for breakfast, a little more for lunch, and then a lot at dinner. Now, on the other side of this, if somebody is if their primary goal is fat loss and they have a strong appetite like myself, um, they may not be like in my case, I'm not typically hungry in the mornings, so I don't like to eat in the mornings. I want to save my calories for when I have my natural hunger drive. So I will choose not to eat until maybe 10 or 11 in the morning because that helps me adhere to my caloric deficit better. But I know that it's probably not as ideal to gain as much muscle mass as I could if I had a high protein meal first thing in the morning. But that's where I'm saying I'm prioritizing fat loss during this time. So I'm willing to have that trade so that I won't be as hungry during my fat loss goal phase.
So you would say it's a matter of priority. So it doesn't need to be constant. There's no reason for your meal frequency to always be the same. You could also periodize it just like you periodize fat loss and muscle gain. So if you're in a isocaloric phase, so at maintenance, or if you're in a muscle building phase in a caloric surplus, you could have protein based higher meal frequency. And then if you struggle with appetite in a fat loss phase, reduce your meal frequency to account for that.
That's exactly what I do.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's what I do as well. And I think it's particularly useful when somebody has a smaller caloric budget. For example, smaller people. I am 5 foot tall. During a fat loss phase, I don't want to eat 5 meals of 200 calories each. Obviously, I
Nice.
don't diet on 1,000 calories, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Okay. And so that's for nutrition. Is there something that you massively changed your mind about in regards to training?
Um, I Yeah, and this is probably a little more recent. I used to think that if you did cardio, that it would really hurt your ability to maximize muscle gain. And I did a very intensive study on this last summer, and there's very little evidence to support that. Now, two things we have to admit. One, we don't have data in large excess muscle bodybuilders. So is it possible if you think of somebody who has a lot carries around a lot of muscle, if they were to do cardio, could that potentially detract from their lean tissue gains? It's possible. But in the mostly untrained, and there are a few studies in resistance trained males, there's more evidence suggesting that doing cardio while resistance training will cause you to gain more lean tissue than lose it. Like 3 studies to 1. Um, and then the other thing that we have to admit is that excess cardio will detract from strength gains. So if you are a power lifter or an athlete who's trying to maximize your strength, you would want to stay away from excess cardio. And
Mm.
also, when I just said that cardio doesn't seem to detract from muscle hypertrophy, I'm not assuming excess cardio. We're just saying a an average or moderate amount of cardio done per week, 3 to 4, 5 sessions per week, 30 minutes per session. I'm not aware of evidence that as I read that literature base, I'm not convinced, and I don't think anybody would be that actually read the studies that it would detract or it would interfere with your ability to gain muscle.
And just to clarify, when you say 3, 4, or 5 sessions of about 30 minutes, what's the intensity there?
I would moderate intensity, so maybe able to have a conversation with somebody, but maybe not.
Okay,
So
yeah, that
more
makes
than a
sense.
walk, but not a sprint.
Fair. And even that for some people would be a lot of cardio. So clearly the dangers of cardio hurting your gains are quite low in your opinion.
Based on the research that I've read, yes.
And what about, since you touched upon cardio, what about cardio and its potential benefits for fat loss? What are your
It's
thoughts on those?
it's incredible. it's it's it is a potent stimulator of fat loss. Um, so I have a thought on this. if I were going to go on a fat loss diet, which actually I'm going to do pretty soon, so I'm actually going to go on a
Mm,
diet myself. Um, but let me put out a scenario. There is some literature to suggest that the longer and longer we go on a diet, the less and less responsive our body becomes to that diet. If I were to just use exercise as my stimulus, so I'm not going to reduce my food intake, I'm just going to rely on cardio to induce fat loss. We will lose body fat, but our body's response to that cardio becomes less and less over time. So I like the idea of staggering fat loss stimuli in an extended fat loss phase. So, as an example, I wouldn't have somebody start reducing their food intake, plus doing cardio, plus resistance training, and taking, let's say, a dietary supplement like caffeine all at once to start. I would assume that they're resistance training. So in my world, everybody lifts weights all the time. It's like their heartbeat of fitness. And then we start with a caloric deficit. So we reduce food 25%. Do that for 2 months or so. Now let's add in cardio, or at least more cardio. Again, I like to think that most people have a base level of cardio. Maybe that's walking a couple thousand steps each day. But now we're adding in cardio, an additional stimulus, because as our body becomes less responsive to the caloric deficit, now we're adding a new fat loss stimulus in the form of cardio. We do that for several weeks, and now would be an opportunity to. I'm a big proponent of caffeine for fat loss. I don't use caffeine for fat loss, but there's research, plenty of research that says it's pretty good at fat loss reduction. And then, so now you're throwing in yet another stimulus. So it's kind of like this graded approach where as your body adapts to the stimulus we've been giving it, we introduce a new one.
yeah, that makes sense. That's the practice I use with my own clients as well. The way I see it and put it to them is that if we pull all the stops from day one, what happens when we plateau?
Yes, yes.
It would be the same as somebody could diet and lose body fat at a reasonable rate on 1800 calories, but we start on 1200 calories. Well, what happens when that stops working? Do we go to 1,000?
Yes. Yep. That's yeah, there's a phrase, you want to diet on as many calories as you can while still losing body fat. Um,
Exactly.
and I generally agree with that, but I think there's also a place to be aggressive with certain restrictions. I'll just give this. My lab did a study a few years ago. It was during COVID. I didn't publish this study yet, but we were more aggressive than what I would recommend, nearly a 40% caloric deficit, but only for 2 weeks, for 14 days, high protein, 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, resistance training. I think it was an average of about 4 days per week. And our subjects, because it was short, even though it was aggressive, they maintained all of their dry fat-free mass, which means when we accounted for losses of water, their their contractile tissue, their protein content remained the same. So again, I'm not an advocate of aggressive dieting, but there can be a place for it when you start a diet as long as it's short.
Yeah, I agree with that. My coaching is very much mindset and psychology based, and for some people, a short period of of using an extreme approach is really motivating, as
Yeah.
long as we know that it's short term, so they know, okay, after this there's the calm after the storm, so to speak, and this is just to kickstart my progress, because some people need to see progress right away, and quite considerable progress as well, in order to feel to commit fully and still be disciplined throughout the entire process.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that we agree on all of this, because I really admire you and the way you think. So I feel validated in my methods now. All right. Dr. Campbell, thank you very much for answering all of my questions. Now, before we end this podcast, I wanted to ask you, is there anything that we might have touched upon, but not in enough depth or in as much depth as you wanted to, or anything we haven't touched upon that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
I don't think so. I think you gave me freedom to kind of go down any rabbit trail that I wanted to. So I think we've mentioned everything that I wanted to elaborate on.
Great. I feel the same. I think we touched upon a lot of different topics that will be very valuable to the listeners. Now, to wrap up the podcast, I'd like to give you space to plug anything you like with some two honorable mentions. One, the Physique Coaching Academy that you just launched. I believe today was the first time I saw it. And also Body by Science.
Yeah, so thank you for mentioning them. So yeah, Physique Coaching Academy, we are launching that course. I think it's May 1st. That's Dr. Lane Norton and myself. We've been working on that for a while. So it's geared towards physique coaches or people who work with clients who are trying to lose body fat, maintain or gain muscle. And then my Body by Science is a research review that I'm very. It's kind of like my pride and joy. I review research studies that are solely focused on fat loss and building muscle. And I try to help people get through because it's hard to read research. So I try to summarize it in a very easy to understand manner. And then I bring in experts from my network that help us apply that research. So, what are they? How would they apply the research that I just summarized? And if anybody's interested in that, if you just go to my website, it's billcampbellphd.com. You can download the inaugural issue for free just to see if it's something that you would find value in.
Thank you. And circling back to the beginning of the podcast, I think Body by Science really encapsulates your view of science as a compass in addition to anecdotal experience, because you bring in coaches that actually work with people in real life to give their opinion on the studies and the science that you discuss in that research review. So I think it's a really valuable resource for practitioners, but also just anyone who's interested in understanding more about how to bring science into their life.
Yes. Yep. Thank you.
No, thank you for providing such an amazing resource. I love Body by Science. And anyway, I will add all of these links in the show notes, dear listeners. Thank you for tuning in. Dr. Campbell, thank you for being on. And I'll speak to you all next time.
Bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in, dear listeners. As per usual, if you want to connect with me or with Dr. Campbell, you're going to find all of the relevant links in the show notes. For now, thank you very much again for being here today, and until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.